Today on the Perception in Action podcast, Visuomotor Calibration and Frames of Reference. Why can even relatively short breaks, like a rain delay or waiting for an opponent to take their turn, hurt performance? So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, I want to pull together a few topics I've discussed in previous episodes to look at an interesting new paper on dart throwing. As I first discussed back in episode 84, when looking at time scales in motor learning, a very well-known effect in skill acquisition research is the so-called warm-up decrement. The warm-up decrement was first discovered by Jack Adams in 1952. In his studies, Adams used a rotary pursuit task, which involves a small target mounted on a wheel spinning around and round, and the participant moving a stylus to stay in contact with the target for as long as possible. So it's basically a test of eye-hand coordination. One of the things he found was that every time participants started a new session of practice, it took them a while to quote-unquote get back up to speed. For example, at the end of day 1, time on target was over 7 seconds, but at the start of day 2, it was only 5.5 seconds. It took about 6 or 7 trials for the participant to get back to the performance level they had achieved on the previous day of practice. So it's as if they needed to warm up a little bit, thus the name given by Adams. This effect, which has been since replicated many times, typically also decreases with each day of practice, but it never quite goes away. So every time we go back to a task, we start off slightly worse than we were the last time we performed it. Why does the warm-up decrement occur? Experiments that followed the ones done by Adams ruled out a couple possibilities. First, it does not seem to be a physical effect. If you allow participants to move around, stretch, etc. before starting a new day's training session, you will still get a warm-up decrement. It has also been shown using other tasks that include a declarative knowledge component that it's not an example of forgetting. One proposed explanation for this effect is Nason and Smith's activity set hypothesis, which was put forth in 1971. They proposed that rather than the warm-up decrement being due to some loss of coordination or skill for a specific task, it is due to a loss in the participant's generalized preparation to respond. This preparation includes 3 things: having the appropriate level of arousal, having attention focused on the right things, and having appropriate expectancies about the task. According to Nason and Smith, these 3 things, which form the activity set, get adjusted to optimal levels during practice, but will be lost during a rest period due to decay or interference from other tasks. But in many ways, the activity set hypothesis is kind of lacking. First, it's pretty vague and weak in its explanatory power. How exactly does attention and arousal change? Under what conditions should we expect the effect to occur and not occur? Nason and Smith's hypothesis cannot really be used to make any testable predictions of this type. Second, it also does not really seem to be a good fit to explain warm-up effects that occur over a matter of a few seconds, rather than ones that occur over hours or days. A good example of this is a paper I want to look at today. In a study published earlier this year in the journal Psychological Research, Wunderlich and colleagues examined warm-up decrement effects in professional darts. To do this, they analyzed match play data from the 2017 Darts Championships. They analyzed the first 2 turns in the match for each player, so 6 throws, and calculated the score and vertical and horizontal error. To do this, they made some assumptions about what the players were aiming for with each throw. For example, aiming for a triple 20 on the first throw. These are described in more detail in the paper. Their main predictions were that the score would be lower and the error higher for the first throw in each set of 3 due to a warm-up decrement type of effect. For those that don't know, in darts you make 3 throws, walk up to retrieve your darts, then wait for your opponent to go before throwing again. So there's a time delay of several seconds before you get to throw again. What was found? As predicted, the score for the first dart thrown in each set of 3 was significantly lower than for the second and third throw. The difference in score between the first dart and the other 2 was about 2.5. While this might sound small, it is actually larger than the difference separating the tournament champion and the semifinalists. The second finding was that the lower score for the first throw was almost totally due to a decrease in vertical accuracy. that is missing the target slightly high or slightly low, as there was no significant differences in horizontal accuracy for the 3 throws in a turn. As you can hopefully see, the activity set hypothesis cannot really do a good job of explaining this effect. These are the absolute best dart players in the world playing in the World Championship, so it's hard to imagine that a delay of a matter of seconds, which they're quite used to, would cause them to lose their attentional focus or become less aroused in some way. Also, if it's just a general effect, then why would it only influence vertical errors and not horizontal errors too? So what's going on here? As discussed in the paper, the other main hypothesis that has been put forth to explain the warm-up decrement seems to be a much better explanation here. That is, that it's a calibration effect. Perceptual motor calibration is something I discussed back in episode 120. In that episode, I primarily focused on the ecological approach to this topic, looking at the work of people like Bill Warren and Jeff Bingham. I will return to that in a little bit, but first I want to look at an alternative view of the calibration process that aligns more with the information processing computational approach to perception action. In this approach, it is argued that the process of calibration primarily involves aligning different frames of reference for action. When we move to interact with objects in our environment, there are 2 frames of reference we need to consider: an egocentric or body-centered one and an allocentric or external one. The term frame of reference is used here to mean the coordinates in which we describe and control action. When we move parts of our body, it's generally assumed that the movement parameters are defined in a body-centered frame of reference. That is, I move my arm away from the midline of my body or lift it above my line of sight, etc. Our movements are controlled and perceived relative to our own body position. But in order to successfully perform a skill like hitting the bullseye with a dart, we need to somehow link this bodily frame of reference with an external frame of reference. In an external frame of reference, positions are now described in coordinates of the outside world, not our body. So for example, the bullseye in darts is located 5 feet 8 inches above the ground. In order to hit the bullseye, the idea is that I somehow need to link the body coordinates of the action to this external frame. So for example, a throw launched 6 inches above my shoulder, a body frame of reference, will hit 5 feet 8 inches above the ground, an external frame. A good example of the difference between these 2 frames of reference can be seen in an effect I've heard described in many different sports. Instances where an athlete perceives that they're moving in a completely different direction than they really are. Consider a common example from baseball batting discussed nicely in Eugene Bleeker's book, Old versus New School. In baseball, it's very common for a batter to claim that they're swinging down at the ball, keeping the barrel of the bat above their hands when they're swinging. However, if you watch the video, they're clearly swinging up at the ball with their hands below the barrel of the bat. So what's going on here? Well, it's an issue of having 2 different frames of reference. For the batter, the perceived position of the hands in the bat and the direction of the swing path is based on the egocentric body frame of reference. That is, it is defined relative to our perceived vertical, which is determined by the orientation of our head and spine. Conversely, for someone watching the player hit like a coach, position and movement direction are based on an external frame. We see how the bat is moving relative to the ground and other objects in the scene. These 2 frames can be different because when most batters hit, they tilt their upper body slightly forward, bending at the waist. This changes the perceived vertical for the batter and their body frame of reference, but does not alter the external frame of reference. As Eugene shows very nicely in a figure, when we look at the photo of the batter in their normal tilted position, the barrel of the bat is clearly below their hands. But if we alter the image so that the batter's spine is now parallel to the edge of the photo, so essentially taking the batter and straightening their body up, the bat is clearly above the hands, consistent with the perception of many batters. By tilting the image, we have aligned these 2 different frames of reference. Okay, let's get back to the issue of calibration and the warm-up decrement. In order to successfully hit an external target, like a bullseye in darts, we need to calibrate the movement, defined in a bodily frame of reference, with respect to the external frame of reference. So, for example, we need to know that a throw launched 6 inches above my shoulder will land with a vertical position of 5 feet 8 inches above the ground. How does this calibration work? Well, several lines of evidence suggest that the link between the body and external frame of reference is established through visual feedback. This can be illustrated in cases where we take vision away. If you show someone an external target, take it away, then ask them to point to the remembered location, most people can learn to do this quite well. But not if we take gravity away. When we take gravity away, the orientation of the body in space, and thus its relation to the external environment, becomes uncertain. That is, we lose calibration between the egocentric and allocentric frames of reference. Without vision to re-establish this calibration, pointing to the remembered locations of targets becomes highly inaccurate and can't be improved very well with practice. Another example is something that Richard Smith was asked to testify about in court as an expert witness many times: so-called pedal errors in driving. These are instances where in an emergency situation the driver steps on the accelerator instead of the brake. Schmidt proposed that this was a frame of reference calibration problem. When we control the pedals in a car, our foot movements are again defined relative to our body. But obviously to hit the correct pedal, this needs to be calibrated to the external positions of the accelerator and the brake. Schmidt proposed that when we suddenly have to move our foot to the pedals, it is easy to have these frames of reference misaligned, because we have no visual feedback to link them. Evidence in support of this comes from the finding that pedal errors occur much less frequently in cars with manual transmissions, as compared to automatic. When driving a stick shift, the left foot which operates the clutch gives a consistent frame of reference for the right foot controlling the accelerator and the brake. More specifically, when vision is available, the link between body-related and external frames of reference is established by fixating a target. That is, keeping the eyes still on an external location. Quote from the article: "Fixation links a position in the external frame of reference to the orientation of the eyes. As a consequence, the fixated position is not only specified in the external frame of reference, but also in body-related frames. Thus, fixation establishes a kind of entrance of a position in external space into representations of the body and the configuration of its segments." End quote. Incidentally, this could provide another reason why having a quiet eye helps performance. It allows for more effective calibration. I'm not going to go into detail about it here, but in the traditional information processing-based approach to motor control, this calibration process involves updating one's internal representations of the outside world. For example, Daniel Wolpert and colleagues have proposed that calibration is a process which involves a pairing between our inverse kinematic controller models and our forward predictor models. Link in the show notes for more detail. Before connecting this all back to the warm-up decrement, I want to just briefly revisit the alternative ecological approach to calibration that I discussed in episode 120. First, it's important to note that in Gibson's view, this problem of linking frames of reference to control movement is a complete non-issue, because we don't perceive our world in terms of an external frame of reference in the first place. In Gibson's view, the information coming in is already linked to our body. For example, we perceive the height of stairs in units of leg lengths, not in meters. More relevant to this paper I'm talking about today, in Gibson's view, the bullseye is perceived in units of eye heights, not feet and inches. In the ecological approach, calibration is the process of establishing a mapping from embodied units of perception, like eye heights, to embodied units of action, like stride lengths. Through exploration of my environment, I essentially learn something like how many stride lengths it will take me to cover a certain number of eye heights or distance. It is this information that allows for scaling of visual information and the perception of affordances. Linking this all back to the warm-up, decrement, and DART study, for either theoretical approach, taking a short break from performing the action will result in a loss of the fine-tuning of calibration. Quote from the DART's paper: "We conjecture that the main source of the warm-up decrement is leaving the dartboard, and thereby displacing the bodily frames of reference relative to the external frame. The main source of the subsequent warm-up is then the fine-tuning of the visuomotor calibration after the feedback provided by the first dart of the throw. This fine-tuning is likely to be a delicate process. Therefore, it seems feasible that this effect could be hidden or less pronounced in less skilled players due to the variability of their performance." End quote. This explanation can also explain the difference between the vertical and horizontal errors in the study. Because controlling the vertical flight of a dart is much more difficult than the horizontal flight, it suffers more from a loss of calibration. Finally, in the ecological view, we would expect a decline in performance immediately after a break because action capabilities are dynamic and change over time. To sum up today's episode, I think there are a couple important points for coaches to consider. The first is this issue of different frames of reference. Remember that when you're observing your athlete, they are perceiving the world using a different frame of reference than you are. This may result in them having difficulty in implementing some of your directional instructions and cause them to perceive the position and movement of their body in a quote-unquote inaccurate way. That is different from what occurs relative to an external frame of reference. Second, it's very important not to overlook the importance of calibration and recalibration in action. For most sports, we seem to have learned that this is required. For example, we let players warm up after halftime and rain delays. But we need to remember that this is more than just a physical process of warming up. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials like written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled.
Straight away. Now you're the winter. We'll cut you quick.